"We will keep you among us forever," were the words that first echoed in that house, whispered by voices that should not exist. Brad arrived at the property as the sun began to sink behind the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky a red that resembled dried blood. The wagon bobbed on the stones of the path, and each bump seemed to alert him that he was approaching something that would change his life forever. He had come to claim the inheritance of Uncle Samuel, a man he had never met in person, but who had left him a farm in the middle of the Arizona desert. The lawyer's letter was folded in his shirt pocket, already yellowed by the sweat and dust of the trip. The house appeared before him as an apparition. It was larger than I expected, with 2 floors and a balcony that stretched across the entire front facade. The wood was faded by the relentless sun, but it still retained a quiet dignity. The windows, all closed by nailed boards, gave the building a blindfolded appearance. Brad got out of the wagon and felt the dry wind whip his face, bringing with it a strange smell, as if the land there held ancient secrets. As he approached the main door, he noticed that the lock was broken. The door opened with a long, deep moan, revealing an interior steeped in thick shadows. The air inside the house was still, heavy, as if it had been trapped there for years. Brad lit a match and saw that the furniture was covered in white sheets, silent ghosts of a life that once existed there. It was then that he heard it for the first time. A low, barely perceptible whisper coming from somewhere on the second floor. Words that he could not distinguish, but that carried a dark promise. Brad climbed the steps of the stairs, each step producing a creak that echoed through the empty house. The upper floor corridor stretched in both directions, punctuated by closed doors that seemed to hold mysteries. The first door he opened revealed a simple room with an iron bed and a dark wooden chest of drawers. But it was when she entered the second bedroom that she felt something different. The air there was colder, and there was a sweet, cloying smell, like withered flowers. On the bed, he found a diary bound in brown leather. The pages were yellowed, but the ink was still legible. The first entries talked about 2 sisters, Margaret and Eleanor, who had come to live with Uncle Samuel after their parents died in an accident. They were described as tall women, with piercing eyes and smiles that did not reach their full faces. Samuel wrote about how they tended the house with disturbing efficiency, always whispering to each other in a language he didn't recognize. Brad continued reading as the night deepened. The diary entries began to reveal strange events. Samuel mentioned how the sisters seemed to know things they shouldn't know, how they predicted storms days before they arrived, how the farm animals became restless in their presence. But most disturbing were the references to visitors who arrived at the farm and were never seen leaving. A strong wind began to blow outside, making the whole house groan and creak. Brad felt a shiver run down his spine when he read the last diary entry, dated just 3 months earlier. "They said they're going to keep me here forever, who are part of this land now, which we all do, that no one else will leave this house. God help me, I start to believe in them." It was at that moment that Brad heard the whispers again, clearer this time. From downstairs, female voices intertwined in an ominous melody. He went down the stairs slowly, the diary still in his hands, and followed the sound into the kitchen. There, standing in the center of the room, he could make out the words that repeated like a mantra, "We will keep you among us forever." The match in his hand went out, leaving him in complete darkness. But even in absolute darkness, Brad could feel that he was no longer alone in the house. Brad lit another match with trembling hands, and the small flame revealed the empty kitchen. The whispers had ceased, but the air still vibrated with a strange energy, as if the words had left an invisible mark on the environment. He explored the closets and found some candles that he lit, scattering them around the house. The flickering light created dancing shadows on the walls, making every corner seem to hide secrets. In the basement, Brad discovered more than he bargained for. In addition to barrels of groceries and farm tools, there was an entire wall covered with old photographs. Serious faces stared back at him through the glass fogged by the years. In the center of the wall, a larger photograph showed 2 tall women dressed in black, flanking a middle-aged man Brad recognized as Uncle Samuel. The women had angular faces and eyes that seemed to follow any movement, even in the still image. Underneath the photograph, a wooden plaque bore the names Margaret Whitmore, Eleanor Whitmore, Samuel Mackenzie, 1887. Brad quickly calculated and realized that the photo was almost 40 years old. If the sisters were alive, they would be very old women now. But the whispers he had heard had young voices, vibrant with a time-defying energy. Next to the wall of photographs, Brad found a locked wooden chest. Using one of the tools in the basement, he managed to force the lock. Inside, he discovered letters, documents, and more diaries. The letters were addressed to people with names he did not recognize, but they all had something in common. They were invitations to visit the farm. The paper was elegant, the handwriting feminine and delicate, but the words carried a sinister weight. One of the letters read, "Dear Mr. Patterson, we learned of your financial difficulties through mutual friends. Our farm offers unique opportunities for men of your quality. Come visit us when you can. We guarantee that you will find everything you are looking for here and much more. With affection, Margaret and Eleanor Whitmore." Brad found dozens of similar letters, all with different dates over 3 decades. Invitations to bankrupt merchants, men wanted by the law, lonely widowers, young people in search of adventure. Everyone was attracted to the farm with promises of refuge, opportunity, or companionship, but there was no return mail, no letter of thanks or farewell. An official document caught his attention. It was a report from the county sheriff, dated 1910, about the disappearance of several men who had last been seen heading toward the Mackenzie farm. The investigation had been dropped after the sheriff reported disturbing experiences during his visits to the property, voices coming from empty places, the constant feeling of being watched, and the Whitmore sisters' report that they had never seen the missing men. As he read, Brad began to feel a presence behind him. He turned slowly and saw 2 tall figures at the entrance to the basement. The sisters were there just as in the photograph, but their black clothes seemed to float regardless of any wind. Their faces were pale as the moon, and their eyes shone with a light of their own in the dim light of the cellar. "Welcome home, Brad," Margaret said, her voice echoing impossible in the confined space. "We've been waiting for you." Eleanor smiled, revealing perfectly white teeth. "Samuel told us a lot about you before he left, about how you were alone in the world, with no family but it, about how I needed a real home." Brad tried to speak, but the words refused to come out. The sisters descended the steps of the basement with fluid movements, as if sliding on the dirt floor. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Brad could see his own breath forming clouds of vapor in the icy air. "You've read Samuel's diary," Margaret continued, her eyes fixed on the papers scattered on the floor. "And the letters. So you already know why you're here. We don't have to write invitations anymore," Eleanor added, her voice like a cold breeze. "You came on your own. The earth called and you answered." Brad finally found his voice. "What did you do with them? With all the men who came here?" The sisters exchanged a look that seemed to carry decades of shared secrets. Margaret moved closer, and Brad could feel the cold emanating from his body like an aura of perpetual winter. "We kept them," she whispered. "As we promised. They never felt loneliness again, never again knew abandonment. They have become part of this land, of this house, of us, and now you will too." The candles in the basement began to flicker, and Brad noticed that the flames were moving toward the sisters, as if attracted by some invisible magnetic force. Darkness began to close around him, and the whispers returned, louder and more urgent. "We will keep you among us forever." Brad ran toward the stairs, but his feet felt heavy as lead. Each step was a fight against a force that tried to pull him back into the depths of the basement, into the outstretched arms of the Whitmore sisters. Brad managed to reach the ground floor, but the house seemed to have changed around him. The corridors stretched longer than he remembered, and the doors that had once been open were now sealed. The candles he had lit burned with bluish flames, projecting a ghostly light that made everything seem distorted and unreal. The air was thick as honey, making it difficult to take every breath. The sisters did not follow him physically, but his presence hung over the whole house like an invisible mist. Brad could feel her eyes watching her every move, hear her whispers echoing through the wooden walls. The repetitive phrase had become a constant chant that seemed to spring from the very structure of the building. "We will keep you among us forever." In the main room, Brad discovered something he hadn't noticed before. The sheets covering the furniture had been removed, revealing chairs arranged in a circle around a dining table. On each chair, men's clothes were neatly arranged, as if their owners had simply disappeared from within them. Hats hung from the backrests, boots were lined up on the floor, and leather wallets lay open on the table, showing photographs of wives and children who would never see their loved ones again. Brad recognized some of the faces in the photographs as the same ones he had seen on the basement wall. the men who had responded to the invitations of the sisters, who had come in search of refuge or opportunity, and who now existed only as memories preserved in a haunted house. Their essences had been absorbed by the earth, their souls trapped forever in that place, forgotten by time. The temperature continued to drop, and Brad saw that his breath condensed into ice crystals that floated in the air before dissolving. The cold did not come from outside, but from inside the house itself, as if the structure were a dead body that radiated the absence of life. Every floorboard, every ceiling beam seemed impregnated with the essence of those who had been absorbed by the Whitmore sisters. Brad tried to reach the front door, but his hands ran through the doorknob as if it were made of smoke. The main door had become intangible, a barrier that existed only in appearance. The windows showed the same phenomenon. He could see them, but he couldn't touch or break them. The house had become a dimensional prison, a space that existed partly in the physical world and partly in another reality. It was then that Brad began to notice changes in himself. His hands seemed less solid, more translucent in the candlelight. When he tried to scream, his voice came out muffled, as if he were talking underwater. The process had begun. He was slowly being absorbed into the house, transformed into yet another essence, trapped forever within those walls. The memories of the other men began to flow through his mind. Brad saw through the eyes of merchants who had come in search of business, of fugitives seeking refuge, of lonely men who longed for companionship. They had all felt the same initial hope when they were welcomed by the sisters, the same feeling of having finally found a place where they belonged. And they had all discovered too late that the price of acceptance was their very existence. In the kitchen, Brad found Uncle Samuel's diary open to a page he hadn't read before. The final entry was being written before his eyes by an unseen hand, words appearing on the page as if traced by a ghost. Brad arrived today. He now understands what it means to be part of this family. The cycle continues as it always has. The earth thirsts, and we feed that thirst with lost souls looking for a home. The wind outside began to howl with an otherworldly intensity, causing the house to groan and sway. But Brad realized that it wasn't really wind. It was the voices of all the men who had been absorbed into the house, their trapped essences circling eternally around the property like a spiritual hurricane. Their own memories began to blend with theirs, creating a collective consciousness that transcended individuality. The sisters appeared again, this time in the main room, more solid and real than before. Margaret held in her hands a book bound in black leather, its pages filled with names written in ink that looked like dried blood. Eleanor held an ancient feather, its tip dripping a dark substance that fell to the ground without making a sound. Brad watched helplessly as Eleanor wrote her name on the last blank page of the book. Each letter seemed to drain more of his physical substance, making him more ethereal and less human. The process was irreversible, and he knew it. He had crossed the threshold from which there would be no return the moment he stepped into that accursed house. The last thing Brad could see clearly was his own reflection in an antique mirror on the wall. His image was fading, becoming transparent as glass, while behind him the figures of dozens of other men began to materialize, all wearing the same expressions of melancholy resignation that he now felt growing in his own heart. Dawn came without the sun penetrating the windows of the house. The light that filtered through was pale and sickly, as if it passed through several layers of funeral veil before reaching the inside. Brad found that he hadn't slept, but he wasn't awake in the traditional sense either. He existed in an intermediate state, conscious but disconnected from his physical body, observing himself from a distance that grew by the moment. During the night, more presences had manifested themselves. The house now teemed with the essences of all the men who had been absorbed over the decades. They circulated through the rooms like an invisible breeze, their whispers mingling in a melancholy chorus that told stories of interrupted lives and lost dreams. Brad could make out their individual voices. The grain merchant who had left 3 orphaned children, the young adventurer who had never known true love, the widower who sought to forget his grief. The Whitmore sisters moved through the house with renewed purpose, their forms now more solid and vibrant than before. Each absorbed soul strengthened them, fed their parasitic existence. Margaret prepared ghostly meals in the kitchen, laying out dishes for guests who would never eat again. Eleanor organized the library, lining up books that told stories of lives that now belonged completely to her. Brad tried to recall his past, but the memories melted away like sand between his fingers. His childhood was mixed with that of other men, his experiences becoming indistinguishable from theirs. Individuality was a luxury that the sisters did not allow to their permanent guests. They all became part of a collective consciousness that existed to serve their purposes, a forced family united by the impossibility of leaving. On the afternoon of that sunless day, Brad witnessed the arrival of a new visitor. A middle-aged man was approaching the house on horseback, following a trail that had not existed when Brad arrived. The newcomer looked tired and desperate, exactly the kind of people the sisters always attracted. Brad tried to scream, to warn him of the danger, but his voice could not cross the barrier between the world of the living and the limbo where he now resided. The sisters came out to greet the visitor with warm smiles and welcoming words. The man seemed relieved to find hospitality in this secluded place. Brad watched helplessly as the same ritual that had deceived him was repeated with a new victim. The cycle continued, perpetuating itself through the centuries like an infernal machine that fed on lost souls. As he watched, Brad began to understand the true nature of the Whitmore sisters. They weren't women who had become supernatural. They were ancient entities that took on human forms to facilitate their hunting. They had belonged to that land for much longer than any historical record could document. Predators that specialized in capturing those who sought refuge or belonging. The new guest was ushered into the house, and Brad could see the exact moment the man realized something was wrong. His eyes widened as he felt the unearthly cold, as he perceived the invisible presences that watched him from every corner. But it was too late. The doors were sealed, the windows became intangible, and yet another soul began its process of absorption. During the night, Brad found himself face to face with Uncle Samuel. The presence of his relative was stronger than that of the others, perhaps because he had resisted for a longer time before succumbing. Samuel looked at him with eyes that carried decades of regret and melancholy acceptance. Through a communication that transcended words, Samuel shared the full story. He had discovered the truth about the sisters years before their physical death, but had chosen to remain to try to protect other travelers. Every soul he could warn or deviate from the house was a small victory against the entities, but the price of his resistance had been his own freedom. Brad understood then that there was a choice to be made. It could fully accept its new existence, allowing itself to dissolve into the collective consciousness and finding a dark peace in surrender. Or she could follow Uncle Samuel's example, keeping her individuality intact, to try to interfere with the sisters' plans, knowing that it would mean an eternity of struggle and suffering. The new guest shouted upstairs, his screams echoing through the walls like those of all who came before him. The sisters whispered their eternal promise as the process began once again. "We will keep you among us forever." The phrase now carried a different weight for Brad. Not just a threat, but also a reminder that some prisoners could choose how to use their life sentences. The house sighed around him, accommodating yet another soul in its otherworldly foundations. And Brad made his decision, knowing that the consequences would extend far beyond his own spectral existence. Brad chose resistance, and with that decision came a clarity he hadn't experienced since he entered the house. His spectral form solidified slightly, gaining substance through the force of his will. He wouldn't be just another voice in the melancholy chorus of the lost. He would be an active force against the Whitmore sisters and their endless cycle of predation. The first manifestation of his new determination came when he was able to interfere with the whispers that the sisters directed to the new guest. Interspersing his own voice with theirs, Brad began to plant seeds of doubt and distrust in the man's mind. It was subtle and exhausting work, like trying to divert the course of a river with his bare hands, but gradually the visitor began to question the welcoming words of his hostesses. The sisters noticed the interference almost immediately. Their forms became more angular and menacing, their eyes shining with an ancestral fury. Margaret and Eleanor began singing in an ancient guttural language, trying to reinforce their control over the house and its spectral prisoners. But Brad found that other souls also responded to his example, finding the courage to resist for the first time in decades. Uncle Samuel was the first to join the silent rebellion. His experience in resisting the sisters became valuable in organizing the other spirits. Together, they formed a network of interference that constantly disrupted the rituals of the entities. Every malevolent whisper was countered by warnings. Every illusion of welcome was shattered by revelations about the true nature of the place. The new guest, a man named Thomas who was looking to escape gambling debts, began to notice the inconsistencies in the sisters' hospitality. He noticed that they never ate during meals, that their shadows moved independently of their bodies, that the temperature plummeted whenever they approached. More importantly, he began to hear the warning whispers that Brad and the others sent through the drafts of the house. The fight between the resistant spirits and the sisters intensified for 3 days and 3 nights. The house shook as if it were the scene of a spiritual earthquake, with objects moving on their own and temperatures oscillating violently between scorching heat and icy cold. The sisters tried to speed up Thomas's absorption process, but they encountered resistance they hadn't experienced in a long time. On the 3rd night, Thomas achieved something that no visitor had achieved in decades. He reached the front door and managed to touch it. The handle was solid under his hand, and when he turned it, the door opened, revealing the night desert outside. The open air entered the house like a gust of freedom, carrying with it the smell of sage and dry earth. The sisters emitted a howl that echoed through the dimensions, a sound that spoke of eras of unquestioned mastery being challenged for the first time. Their forms began to unravel, as if the flight of a single soul could shake the foundations of their power. Margaret and Eleanor writhed in the air, their essences fragmenting into chunks of shadow and impotent fury. Thomas ran to his horse and galloped away from the property, taking with him the first real victory against the Whitmore sisters. But their escape created a fissure in the otherworldly fabric that held the house together. Brad felt that the dimensional structure was beginning to crumble, offering a unique opportunity for the trapped spirits. One by one, the souls absorbed over the years began to break free. Some chose to follow the fissure toward whatever existed beyond physical death. Others chose to remain attached to that land, but now, as guardians rather than prisoners, protecting future travelers from the dangers that still inhabited the desert. Brad stayed until the end, making sure that everyone who wanted to leave could do so. Uncle Samuel chose to stand by him, 2 spectral sentinels united by the common purpose of protecting the innocent. The Whitmore sisters were not destroyed, but their power had been severely weakened, and their ability to create dimensional traps was broken. When the sun rose for the first time in decades over the Mackenzie estate, the house had transformed, still haunted, still dangerous to the unsuspecting, but no longer an inescapable prison. Brad watched the golden light invade the rooms that had previously known only perpetual shadows, and he knew that he had found a purpose greater than any normal life could have offered. The whispers now had a different tone as they echoed through the walls of the house. No longer the ominous promise, "We will keep you among us forever," but a protective warning to those who approached. Beware of the shadows that remain. Not all who dwell here wish evil, but evil still dwells here. Brad had found his redemption in resistance, his peace in the perpetual protection of others, and as he peered over the horizon where Thomas had disappeared into the safety of the world of the living, he learned that some prisons could be turned into purposes, and some curses could become blessings to those brave enough to choose the path of light, even in the eternal shadows of the Wild West. If this story of courage and eternal endurance has touched your heart, you can't miss our upcoming adventures in the American Wild West, where men face not only the dangers of the desert, but also forces that defy the very nature of existence. Subscribe to the channel to follow more narratives about lost souls who find redemption in the most unlikely places, and leave your comment below telling us what was the most exciting moment of this Brad journey for you. Was it when he discovered the truth about the Whitmore sisters, when he made the brave decision to resist, or when he managed to free Thomas and break the cycle of decades of spiritual prison?